Hello and welcome back. Most often, when people refer to the civil rights movement, they focus on the mid-1950s and mass protests against racial segregation and discrimination. While these actions were important and often heroic, the struggle for civil rights is much longer and broader. The movement had its roots in the efforts of African slaves and their descendants to abolish slavery. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the movement sought to claim the rights won with the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments that were a result of the Civil War. The 14th Amendment addressed civil rights and equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment guaranteed voting rights. Ultimately, these amendments were the basis for Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, the Supreme Court decision that dismantled racial segregation in schools and public facilities. Through nonviolent protest, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and early 60s broke the pattern of segregation in public facilities by race in the South and expanded voting opportunities. Ultimately, they resulted in breakthroughs in equal rights legislation with the passage of the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1965. But as these legislative victories were occurring, militant black activists had begun to aggressively confront enduring economic, political, and cultural consequences of past racial oppression. In their view, new laws would not change the everyday reality of the black community. We will return to these actions in a later lecture. While most popular representations of the civil rights struggles focus on the 1950s and 60s and the leadership of Martin Luther King, the movement had a long history which encompassed a diverse range of leaders, organizations, and strategies. It is best to characterize the civil rights movement as a coalition of thousands of local efforts spanning several decades, hundreds of groups, and a range of strategies and tactics. In our lecture today, we will cover two main issues. The first is early 20th century civil rights actions. The second is militant nonviolence. Okay, let's get started. In the 1890s and early decades of the 20th century, African Americans developed various strategies to challenge racial discrimination in the United States. One of the most prominent early leaders was Booker T. Washington, an educator who emphasized economic development without openly challenging the Jim Crow system. In 1895, Washington gave a speech called the Atlanta Compromise that made him nationally famous. In the speech, he presented a plan for improving conditions of the black community. It called for avoiding direct confrontation over segregation. Instead, it relied on long-term educational and economic advancement of the black community. At the time, lynching in the South had reached a peak. Part of the reason was that black voters were seeking to elect their own representatives. To reduce perceived threats among the white community, Washington called on the black community to focus their attention on improving their skills and developing their own businesses. He argued that it was not time to challenge Jim Crow segregation and the disenfranchisement of black voters in the South. By the way, the phrase Jim Crow comes from a derogatory depiction of slaves. Jim Crow was a character in a play that was always jumping, singing, and dancing. This depiction was meant to show that slaves were simpletons who were not intelligent enough to make their own decisions and could not survive unless they were ruled by masters. In the South, Jim Crow laws mandated segregation of public facilities like schools, restrooms, hotels, drinking fountains, and restaurants. Washington's skills as an organizer and orator mobilized a nationwide coalition of middle-class blacks and church leaders, as well as philanthropists and politicians, with a long-term goal of building the community's economic strength by focusing on self-help and schooling. In this picture, we see him with President Teddy Roosevelt. An outcome of this coalition was the creation of black vocational schools and colleges in the South. In this picture, we see him sitting next to millionaire philanthropist Andrew Carnegie. While Washington had a lot of success, other African American leaders felt that racial discrimination had to be challenged directly. W.E.B. Du Bois was a leader of a more militant black response to the Jim Crow laws. He was a Harvard University educated scholar that became a leading advocate for civil rights and Pan-African unity among African Americans and African descendants elsewhere in the world. Here we see him as a young Harvard scholar, and we also see him later as a civil rights elder statesman. At first, Du Bois supported the Atlanta Compromise. But by the early 1900s, he felt it was time to offer a direct assault on laws that allowed segregation. In 1909, he was part of a group that set up the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which promoted racial equality. Thurgood Marshall, who 60 years later would become the first black Supreme Court justice, was another founding member. Along with Du Bois and a number of white supporters, the NAACP publicized racial injustices and initiated lawsuits to secure equal treatment for African Americans in education, employment, housing, and public accommodations. Unlike Booker T. Washington, they sought to use a legal system to confront segregation directly. As noted in an earlier lecture, the period around World War I was an active civil rights era. Income and savings from wartime employment allowed African American leaders to gain financial support from a broader range of the black community. While the NAACP maintained alliances with white supporters, it also did not want to be dictated to. To some extent, they were able to do this because of the newfound wealth resulting from World War I. But as with everyone else, the coming of the Great Depression had a negative impact on the black community's well-being and their ability to support the civil rights actions. In the 1940s, the NAACP faced competition from various groups offering alternative strategies for racial advancement. A. Philip Randolph is pictured on the right, and Paul Robeson on the left. As you may recall, in an earlier lecture, we noted that on a number of occasions, black workers went on strike during World War II. When labor leader A. Philip Randolph threatened to stage a march on Washington, President Franklin Roosevelt issued an executive order against employment discrimination in wartime defense industries. But Roosevelt's order had little effect on the industrial practices. As a result, the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, an interracial group, continued to organize work stoppages and after the war organized civil disobedience actions to combat segregation in northern cities. Du Bois, who had split with the NAACP, and prominent African-American entertainer Paul Robeson promoted civil rights protests and were critical of the Cold War foreign and domestic policies of President Truman. They argued that Cold War fear and politicians like Joseph McCarthy denied freedom of speech. In effect, civil rights leaders who were critical of U.S. practices were accused of being Soviet spies. Still, the 1950s opened on a positive note. In 1954, the NAACP won a major legal victory in its case Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. The Supreme Court ruled that public school segregation was unconstitutional. Nevertheless, frustration set in when the court did not set a timeline for states to desegregate their school systems. Instead, they merely called for desegregation with all deliberate speed. The increasingly assertive actions through the 1940s, along with frustration over the Supreme Court's unwillingness to define a timeline for desegregation, set the stage for the civil rights actions of the 1950s. Earlier in the lecture, we noted that the civil rights movement is best understood as a coalition of thousands of local efforts. This can clearly be seen in the range of actions occurring in the 1950s. In December 1955, NAACP activist Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. This sparked a sustained bus boycott that inspired mass protests elsewhere to speed the pace of civil rights reform. Boycott supporters chose Baptist minister Martin Luther King Jr. to head the newly established Montgomery Improvement Association, the MIA. King became the country's most influential advocate for the concepts of nonviolent resistance that originated in the independence movement of India and led by Mahatma Gandhi. Martin Luther King Jr. came from a family with a heritage of civil rights actions. King Sr. was active in the civil rights movement of the 1920s. He was pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, where he used his position of influence to promote racial equality. He was respected in the black and parts of the white community. King Jr. learned much about leadership and coalition building across racial lines from his father. Although Martin Luther King Jr. was only in his late 20s as the bus boycott broke out, he already had substantial experience in leadership. In turn, although his house was bombed and other acts of intimidation by segregationists targeted MIA leaders, they were able to sustain the boycott until November 1956, when the NAACP won a Supreme Court order to desegregate the bus system. In 1957, King Jr. and his supporters founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to promote an institutional framework supporting local protest movements. From 1957 to 1960, King Jr. actively promoted the civil rights cause in books he published and speeches he gave in northern and southern cities. As noted earlier, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation was unconstitutional, but had not provided a timeline to implement its ruling. It simply said, with all deliberate speed. In Little Rock, Arkansas, the superintendent of schools, Virgil Blossom, submitted a plan to the school board to implement the court's ruling. The NAACP wanted to move as fast as possible, but white communities in the South wanted the opposite. Initially, Bloom's plan was to move quickly, but it was changed by the school board. Ultimately, small steps to integrate schools began in 1957 and started with a high school. But when black parents registered 9 students for the fall term, the governor, Orville Fauvus, declared that he would not allow them to attend. He dispatched the Arkansas National Guard to assure that the black students could not enter the school. The governor's actions were cheered by many in the white community, but also drew national attention. More importantly, it forced President Eisenhower to weigh in on the issue. Initially, the president favored slow implementation of the court's ruling. But when the governor used the National Guard to block implementation of a Supreme Court ruling, the president felt he had to act in order to defend the authority of the court. The president nationalized the Arkansas National Guard and ordered them to guarantee that black students would be allowed entrance to the school. In response, the school board began to close public schools and return property tax. White parents were allowed to use those taxes to pay for newly opened private schools. Interestingly, some of the new private schools used the facilities of public schools that were just closed. These actions sought to circumnavigate the court's decision. While these actions stalled the progress of desegregation, they also pushed civil rights activists to become more assertive in promoting their cause. Beginning in 1960, the nonviolent resistance movement, started by Rosa Parks, was widened by students acting independently from older civil rights organizations. 4 black college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, started a new phase of the civil rights movement when they staged a sit-in at a drugstore lunch counter reserved for whites. This was followed by students in at least 60 cities staging their own sit-in strikes during the winter and spring of 1960. Older civil rights organizations like the NAACP and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference tried to manage the sit-in movement. But soon protesters had formed their own leadership groups, the most important being the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, which listened to the counsel of older groups, but made their own decisions. SNCC gradually acquired a staff of full-time organizers and launched a number of projects designed to achieve desegregation and voting rights. Although SNCC's nonviolent tactics were influenced by King Jr., their organizers typically stressed the need to develop self-reliant local leaders to sustain grassroots movements. The Freedom Rides began in 1961 and signaled the beginning of a period when civil rights protests grew in size and intensity. As nonviolent protests grew, so did violent reaction to them. The Freedom Rides challenged segregation of buses and bus terminals by refusing to abide by local laws. Black and white students sat together on buses and refused to leave their seats when they were ordered to do so. After attacks by white mobs in Alabama turned back the initial protesters, student activists from Nashville and other centers of sit-in activities continued the rides into Jackson, Mississippi, where they were promptly arrested for disobeying racial segregation laws. The Freedom Rides encouraged similar protests elsewhere against segregated transportation facilities and stimulated local campaigns in many Southern communities that had been untouched by the sit-in movement. In 1963, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference launched a major campaign in Birmingham, Alabama. Their actions were widely televised and showed confrontations between nonviolent protesters and vicious policemen with clubs and dogs. Martin Luther King was one of the protesters arrested, and while in jail, he wrote a public document called A Letter from Birmingham City Jail, where he defended civil rights disobedience and warned that frustrated African Americans might turn to black nationalism if the federal government did not actively defend their civil rights. The news coverage in Birmingham attracted Northern supporters and resulted in federal intervention to bring about a settlement that included civil rights concessions. The Freedom Rides demonstrated that militant but nonviolent young activists could confront Southern segregationists at its strongest points and pressure the federal government to intervene to protect the constitutional rights of African Americans. Mass protests in dozens of other cities made the nation more aware of the antiquated Jim Crow system. They culminated on August 28, 1963, in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom that attracted over 200,000 participants. Martin Luther King Jr. used his concluding "I Have a Dream" speech as an opportunity to link black civil rights aspirations with traditional American values. International news coverage of the Birmingham clashes and the March on Washington promoted President John F. Kennedy to introduce legislation that eventually became the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These laws sought to fully implement the constitutional guarantees of the 14th and 15th Amendments that were ratified almost 100 years before. With this new legislation, the civil rights movement appeared to successfully culminate 100 years of struggle. But implementation of the laws had to compete with the Vietnam War for the government's attention. Ultimately, the war took focus away from the civil rights movement. One result was that young people, both black and white, reacted angrily. A new wave of protest, often violent, appeared throughout the nation. We will discuss these actions in an upcoming lecture. For now, we will close this lecture. See you in class.